Welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest, Dr. Sanjay Udani, former technologist and Vice President for Public Policy at Verizon. Dr. Udani has an extensive background. He was one of the original architects and led a team to help develop and execute the Fios broadband network for Verizon, and is a former professor at the University of Pennsylvania for over a decade. As a precursor, I should say that Dr. Udani retired in 2024 and no longer represents Verizon, and his views are in a personal capacity only. Thank you so much for having me and sharing your views on important topics of the day.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to chat with you.
So let's start with some easy ones. What have you been doing with your time? What excites you as you left public policy?
Sure. So I was thinking about this. I think the last time I had this much time off was before I was in kindergarten.
Kindergarten?
So it's been fun to just kind of not have a rush. I've been, doing everything, reading books, catching up on news, just taking my time doing things. And I have to say, it's really nice. I highly recommend it.
Do you miss the corporate setting? Do you miss the coworkers, the public policy issues?
I think the social interactions, definitely. Some of the issues maybe, but in general, I would say it's a lot nicer to not be rushing, which, you and I both know how DC is. So I think in that sense, it's been great.
And are you, looking back on your career, as you consider and you have some more time and you're reading through things, what are you most proud of, and what captures your disappointment on things you maybe didn't exactly get right?
Sure. I think of course, my favorite is the designing Fios. So we started doing this back in 2003 when I was still relatively new at Verizon. And if you recall those days, most of the country was using dial-up. And here we were doing fiber to the home. And not just fiber to the home, which was somewhat deployed in Japan and other countries, but we were doing a triple play. So voice, video, and data. And so we were the first in the world to do this at scale, and it was a really fun time, and we came across all sorts of issues, challenges that we had never even thought about, and so that was a really fun time to, those 10 years or so was great in terms of designing things. I think the disappointment, it's more of an industry thing. I would say that I wish as an industry we had spent more time getting people focused beyond just speed when you're talking about broadband. It's easy marketing, right? To say, well, my broadband is faster than your broadband because I offer 100 megabits and you offer 80. Unfortunately, it doesn't really mean much. To me, it's sort of like if you go to a car dealership and say, you know what, all I care about is the speed, the top speed of the car, and nothing else, right? You'd never do that. But for broadband, that's what we've done. And unfortunately, I think it's biting us in some of the policy issues and technology at this point. So I think that's the one place I would have changed if we could have back in the early days.
Interesting. I use that analogy. I like that very much.
Sure.
So let's turn to some policy issues, if you might. The BEAD program has been talked a lot in the news recently. This is the subsidy program to get those consumers, those Americans who are unserved today, to have access. It's been, designed in the Biden administration, and the new Trump administration is considering what to do with those requirements that are on the BEAD providers who eventually could win, and whether to alter that altogether. Are you surprised that were you surprised by the Biden administration's addition of many requirements on the BEAD providers, the winners?
Yeah, so I'm more familiar with the technology side of it, so I'll focus on that. I think for this, I wish from the start the focus had been what are the requirements for services, right? So for example, let's say that your broadband has to be able to support 4 Zoom sessions along with some downloads and maybe a high-def video stream. That's the requirement. And then work from there to go to what's the speed that you need, what's the latency, those kinds of things, as opposed to just pulling numbers out of the air, right? 100 megabits or gigabit. Those don't really have any sort of basis And so to me, right from there, you started running into issues. And this is, again, going back to my previous point about, unfortunately, the industry focused on speed alone. And so the regulators did the same thing. And the reason that matters to me is that it helps decide what technology becomes acceptable, right? If you say you need a gigabit as a minimum, all of a sudden you're ruling out a lot of other options that could have been considered before. So I think that's one of my sort of technical issues, that a lot of the requirements for the technicals was not really neutral, but also they were sort of, not really supported by the facts of the services.
As someone who worked on FiOS, though, the administration built this fiber preference and tilted the playing field, and now that's under examination. But were you worried, or are you worried that fiber may become, that other technologies could subsume the area where fiber was supposedly going to take?
Oh, that's a great question. So, as one of the designers for fiber to the home, I love fiber, right? It's awesome. If all things were equal, I would say absolutely fiber is awesome. All things are never equal, right? So with BEAD and in general, we want to have broadband deployed as quickly as possible to as many homes as possible at the lowest cost possible. And so you have to consider things beyond fiber from that perspective, right? If cost was no issue, time was no issue, sure, fiber. But there's so many other technologies out there that are capable of delivering what customers want. And I think by excluding them, I think we're kind of shortchanging the deployment itself.
How do you respond to the argument, well, you have fiber in many localities like this one that we're in, but somehow to be shortchanged in America, wherever that's unserved today? So
my favorite example is myself. So I got FiOS back in 2005, and my current home speed is 75 megabits per second. I have no need to update it. I have not upgraded it. I have a family of 4, and during the pandemic, all of us would be on video calls and doing all sorts of things, and never had a problem. 75 megabits per second. Doesn't really need fiber. You can do that with fixed wireless. You can do that with satellite. So to me, again, going back to the focus on what services you're trying to support. 10 years from now, will you need a gigabit? Maybe. We don't know that. Right? As of right now, I don't know that there's any services that would need that kind of speed. And if it does happen, the technologies will sort of evolve to match that. I'm not too concerned about that. So yes, fiber would be great, but I think other technologies are capable of meeting the needs.
So let's back up a little bit and talk about your experience on how government changes or didn't change your activities at a leading communications company. How did the burdens that the government placed on providers alter decisions? Were they an afterthought, and you had to charge this way and you have to just deal with them, or did they change which markets you went to? Did they have a heavy influence on the company decisions?
I would say very heavy influence. And again, I speak as an engineer. So going back to when I first started at Verizon, we were doing DSL, and this is around 2000-ish. And, I came up with a way of inserting content at the edge. This is back in the DSL days. And, this was using PPPoE, which is one of those wonky protocols. And I wanted to do something at the edge and terminate it. And the lawyers went, oh, you can't do that because that would change the way the technology is viewed from a regulatory perspective. And so if we do that, then the whole thing changes. And I went, that makes no technical sense at all. For FiOS, I spent months of my life looking at all the different services that we offered on plain old telephony service POTS. And we had to support every single one of them, even though the vast majority of them were not being used by anyone. So a lot of the technical decisions have been impacted by sort of the policy/regulatory space. Some make sense. I'm not going to say that all don't. It's just that a lot of times you kind of have to do it as a checkbox, whether it makes sense from a technical perspective or not.
So to your point you made earlier, how do you rank, or where do you put other technologies for broadband? What do you think of wireless broadband, which 30-year-old company does both. And where do you put something like satellite broadband? How do you put them in your mix as you're thinking through?
I think all of them are great options, and I would say let the market decide, right? So for fixed wireless access, which is the one that's been taking off like crazy, I think at this point there's well over 8 or 9 million customers nationwide between Verizon and T-Mobile, and I think AT&T is in the game now too. That's from essentially zero, 3 or 4 years ago. So it's taken off. People love it. If you look at the reviews, people love it, even compared to cable and fiber. And so I would say, well, if 8+ million people love the service, then obviously it's doing something right. Same thing with satellite. I believe that LEO satellites have around 1 million customers at this point, or somewhere in that range. And so if customers are happy with it, then really you need to have a reason why you wouldn't want it as part of your deployment. And so I think with Verizon and AT&T and T-Mobile, I think they're looking at it as, we'll do fiber where we can. Where we can't, we're going to do fixed wireless. And then in areas where you really can't access it for whatever reason, then satellite may be a good option. So it's sort of a mix and match play, which again, from a technical perspective, makes a lot of sense.
Did you find when working through wireless broadband that there were going to be capacity issues? How did you see those things coming together?
So absolutely. So for fixed wireless, you're using the existing cell towers to connect customers. So you do have to manage capacity. And a couple of different ways of doing this. One is to add density, so add more cell towers. Another is to add more spectrum, which is a challenge. So you kind of manage it that way. But I would point out that even with fiber, there is a capacity question, because it's not just the fiber going from your home to the central office. What happens beyond that matters. And so managing the capacity there is a challenge as well. And then same thing with satellite, where they have to manage the capacity. So I would say, yeah, could you use a satellite connection to connect all of New York City? Probably not. That would be a bit too much density. Could you connect, a given neighborhood? Absolutely. So I think this is where you have to think of it as sort of, building blocks where you can mix and match based on need and capability, rather than you say, well, no, this can't support, the most dense concentration of customers. That's bad broadband. Because if you do it that way, then you're really kind of missing out on sort of the best of all worlds.
And do you worry that some households are going to argue that they didn't get broadband as you do in your locality? They got a substandard technology, even if it meets all of their needs?
And this is, I think, where we as an industry could have done better, right? The focus on speed alone. And so you're right. If one neighborhood has Fios that offers 1 gigabit and another one has, fixed wireless that offers 100 megabits, let's say, you might feel that, you're not getting the full speed. But like I said, I've got fiber and I've got 75 megabits and I've had it for 15 years and I've never ever had a glitch or issue in terms of the speed. And so I think just helping people understand that it's not just about the speed. There's other things that matter. How reliable is the service? How many outages do you have? What kind of security does it offer? What's the latency? All of the other things matter. And unfortunately, we focus on just one number, and that kind of leads to what you just said.
Someone missing out.
Yeah. It's the FOMO, right?
It's FOMO. So let's switch just a little bit and talk about some wireless issues. Talk about 5G.
Sure.
There's been some critique that 5G's either been very successful or complete failure, depending on who you are. I'm maybe in the middle, more towards success side than failure. But what is your take on different aspects? And let's start maybe on carrier deployment. Were you pleased at the rate of the network being upgraded to 5G?
I think this is another one where people have started thinking about the Gs, the 3G, 4G, 5G, along the lines of your iPhone, right? You get a new iPhone each year, 15, 16, 17, and so people expect that you'll have the latest and greatest technology, and if you don't have that, then you've fallen behind. And yet, you and I both know that there's areas in the country where your 4G connection is going to be significantly better than 5G, even today. And so, to me, the 5G, 4G discussion has been sort of convoluted in the sense that if you focus on speed alone, then yeah, 5G has been deployed and it's out there, but is that it? In that case, I would say it didn't succeed. if you're looking at what is the potential now going forward, now as we deploy the additional features of 5G, I think the next few years will determine whether 5G becomes really successful or whether it's just an upgrade from 4G, because we now will have the core becomes 5G. Right now the core is still 4G in most cases. And so once you have all these advanced capabilities, we'll deploy them as an industry. Will there be services that need that beyond just the speed? And if the answer is no, then, what do you do with that? I don't know. The problem is the edge. The services that we expected 5G to use have taken a lot longer, have been a lot more challenging. The classic example is AR/VR, right? Okay, we're going to put on the goggles and we'll be connected using 5G. Well, putting goggles on and using them for more than a few minutes is a challenge, right? Companies have spent tens of billions trying to perfect it, and they still haven't been able to. So to me, will 5G be successful with the advanced services? I think that question is going to be answered by, will there be services that need that capability, the network slicing, low latency, what have you? Because as a network, we can offer that. But what are you going to use it for? And if you don't find good uses for it, I think that's where you kind of go, well, so what's the point of 5G advanced? And then that, of course, impacts 6G.
Well, 5G, one of the benefits that has been talked about is the advanced standards and incorporating all these other services you talked to, all the other industries where wireless becomes not an add-on, but a functionality rather than a service into itself. It's no longer about the cell in your pocket or the phone in your pocket. It's about wireless in every different component. Mm-hmm. Do you think those other industries will, as you talked about AR, VR being maybe less enthusiastic or advanced or deployed than we might thought? Do you see other sectors, where it may take off quicker?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the other sectors are doing this. I mean, everything is connected at this point, whether you like it or not, right? I mean, we're seeing some downsides of having everything connected. So I think some of the stuff is going to take off, some of it will fail. Which one, I honestly don't know. I think the security issues might help determine this, because we're starting to see some of the IoT type devices having some real security backdoor issues. And that might make consumers kind of back off from some of these capabilities. Do you really want your bedroom alarm clock to now be hacked and someone can be watching you? Maybe not. So I think that's going to be the push is going to be not so much from the services being offered, it's going to be how are the services secured? And then from a 5G perspective, what kind of security can you offer? What can you do for me beyond just giving me the connection, which has been the focus up to now?
You mentioned the next standard, 6G. We're 5 years away from when the anticipation of the new standard will be available. Mm-hmm. Is it premature to be and have a new standard when 5G has so much runway and to be talking about 6G? Or do you need that constant new vision of what 6G might have to keep progress going forward?
I think from a marketing perspective, you need the 6G. So I don't know, I think the next Olympics in 2028, I can almost guarantee that there'll be some version of networking deployed that will be called 6G or early 6G by then. And that's mostly marketing politics. But as far as features, the way the cycle works is that you deploy a technology, let's say 4G, and then we start using it, including in ways that you didn't expect it, and we kind of go, oh yeah, I wish 4G was better in this way and that way, and you take that and you feed it back into the standard cycle, and then that leads you to 5G. With 5G right now, we're still very much focused on sort of the basic connectivity. We haven't done any of the real advanced stuff yet. Over the next few years, hopefully we will, and we'll learn from it, and that is what should be feeding back into 6G. But if you don't let that happen naturally, if you try to force 6G and say, well, you know what, we're going to throw all these great ideas into 6G. Well, okay, but are you sure that there'll be services for it? Because you haven't really tested it in 5G yet. So I worry that 6G might include a lot of features that are there because we had to rush it, not because there was a need for it. And I think that's the balancing act that we have to do.
Did you worry in your last role in terms of the finances? All the investment the company's making in terms of actually getting a return. Was it marketing and some of the hype worth it, or was it, is that a tough pressure point on you?
I think it's a pressure point on the entire industry, right? Because with 5G and 6G, we're seeing this being discussed at the presidential level, right? President Biden mentioned it during his meeting with President Modi, right? That we were going to do 5G Open RAN and those kinds of things. Things that in the normal scenario you'd never hear about. And yet you have countries saying we have to take the lead in this. And so that puts a lot of pressure on industry to come up with newer versions of this, where before you kind of went along, like 3G to 4G, the evolution happened almost, I wouldn't say naturally, but gradually. Now there's this pressure, the additional pressure from outside, that no, you have to do 6G because we have to lead, which I get it. But that now adds the factor of, well, yeah, but even if you're not ready, you have to now start deploying it.
Fair enough. Let's switch a little bit and talk about last month or just recently we concluded the Mobile World Congress. And one of the interesting things that I thought that came out of that discussion from afar was the idea, or at least the notion, that network usage may be slowing substantially. We had massive rise during the pandemic, and the overall take is decreasing. Are you surprised if that's accurate? Are you surprised by that notion? Did you have an estimation that things were always going to go skyrocketing, or was this built into kind of your thinking?
So that's a good one. The past 10 or 15 years, if you look at all the stats that Cisco and there's a bunch of other companies that come up with them, it was showing basically a rise in video, because that's the one that drove most of the consumption, right? I mean, that's the high bandwidth usage. And I think at this point, we're getting to the point where you can only consume so much video, right? I mean, unless you're consuming it 24/7, which, your kids and mine might be. But at some point, you can only put so much high definition video on a small screen, that we all carry. So I can see why it's starting to plateau a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised if it starts going up again over time based on other services, right? So right now we think of it as you're consuming bandwidth only when you're watching that screen. Maybe in a few years there'll be a service where you're consuming bandwidth even when you're not watching the screen. So I think it's not an unreasonable assumption that we're plateauing for now. I wouldn't take that as we're never going to go back up again. We humans tend to just consume more and more capacity. It's just a question of how easy it is for us to get it.
Another policy issue, one of the things that kept me up at night, and maybe you as well, I'll call it cybersecurity, hacking, attacks. How prepared are the networks for dealing with this, and how often did you have to face incidents? Were they more on the benign side, or was it a constant by some really serious players?
So I think if you talk to any CISO, in any of the telecom, frankly, any company, it's a constant attack. I wasn't directly involved in a lot of the specifics of this, so I can't speak to any individual case, but it's a constant attack. And it's everyone. It's not just your script kiddies from 20 years ago. It's state actors. It's you name it. And so it's an interesting challenge because on one hand, it's such a huge issue. But on the other hand, from a consumer perspective, people almost seem to have tuned it out. You as a consumer, you get all these notifications, right? A data breach and all of this. At some point, you just go, I can't do anything about it. I'm just going to tune it out. And to some extent, that's what we're seeing. And so the tough challenge for companies is, how do you make consumers care about something where they've just kind of saturated and kind of said, you know what, I don't know what to do. I'm going to get hacked no matter what I do. So why should I worry about it? And I think that's not a great place to be. So I think we need to figure out some better way of doing it, because this is just going to keep getting worse. I mean, with AI and others, I mean, you're seeing, I was just reading the other day that, there's apps that you can, with just a few seconds of your voice, they can now replicate it and have you say things that you never said, right? So once this podcast goes online, people can replicate my voice and yours, obviously, and now make you say things that you never did. What does that do? I don't know that we as a society are ready for that.
Fair point. Fair point. What is there anything that government can do to help? There's been lots of different bills. You mentioned notifications. Some of those are mandated by law. You mentioned security requirements on companies. Is there anything that the government can do to improve the situation, or is there always going to be a cops and robbers kind of approach to cybersecurity and hacking?
I think that's a tough one. I again, having stepped back for 6 months, I'm not completely in the loop, but I think one of the challenges was there were so many committees looking at this in so many different parts of the government and coming up with contradictory sort of, suggestions or recommendations. So I think streamlining some of this, having, maybe 1 or 2 places where all of this gets dealt with would make a lot more sense than to have, 30 different places where companies like Verizon or AT&T might have enough people to actually send them to the committees. Smaller companies wouldn't. How many meetings can one person attend from one company? So I think streamlining a lot of that would be useful, and then having sort of a more working together kind of relationship with companies and industry rather than sort of an adversarial one. I think it's going to be critical because the rest of the world, that's happening, right? I mean, when you think about China, they're working hand in hand really on these issues. And so how do we do that as a country? And more importantly, how do we get consumers to care? Because I think that's a real challenge right now.
What is your take as technologist? What's your take on one of the hottest topics right now, artificial intelligence? Where do you think it's going? How do you think it's been, captured in the narrative? What are your thoughts?
So one of my favorite quotes is, it's attributed to Roy Amare. It's called Amare's Law. And his quote is that we tend to overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. And I think right now we're at the overestimation phase for AI, where, 6 months ago, everyone's assuming AI is going to do everything. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, yeah, it's been hyped too much. There's hallucinations. It's not going to do this. It's not going to do that. I really do think that within the next 5 years, it's going to have a huge impact on basically every white-collar job you can imagine. And so I think we as a society are not prepared for that. You've got young kids, I've got kids. What would you recommend, as a field? Should they be training themselves on? I don't know the right answer, because every industry that you and I can think about is going to be significantly impacted. So I think as a society, we have to figure out what is it that humans can do when you have machines that are as smart, if not smarter, than the average human.
I was reading something last night, said in year 2000, it was all about coding, right? Send your kids to coding schools, right. And it's dropped significantly since then, and we're almost bottomed out, right. On coding, because there's so many other mechanisms to do that. But you raised the interesting point of how smart they can become, or how intelligent artificial AI can become. Do you worry that they can become as smart or equal to humans in some capacity, and therefore, there's some kind of control that's needed over them, some kind of kill switch?
I don't know about kill switch, but I think that is something we're going to have to figure out as a society, as a global thing, because it's not just a question of what the US does or Europe, it's the whole world. And right now there's the FOMO thing going on, that if the US backs off on doing some of this research, well, then China is going to do it anyway. So in that sense, it's kind of like the nuclear race, right? Like no one wants to back off because everyone thinks that the other countries are going to do it. How do we make sense of that as a world? I don't know that we're there. I don't know that politically that we're there to be able to even make a rational decision on that. So I'm not overly optimistic on us figuring that out. I think we're just going to stumble along. Maybe something bad will happen, and then we'll go, oh, we really need to do something.
Were you surprised that huge investments are being made and stocks were fluctuating based on how much money was being invested in and deployed in building these advanced systems, and then a small company out of China, DeepSeek, is able to throw out a product that really just crashed the market? Was that surprising to you?
Not really. I mean, so first of all, I don't know that DeepSeek is all that earth-shattering. I think people were aware of it for a while. So but point taken. That's how technology works, right? I mean, even with Fios, when we were deploying fiber to the home, there was no guarantee it was going to succeed. In hindsight, it's sort of duh, fiber to the home, broadband. But when we were doing this back in 2005, if you look at the stock price, that was actually a pretty steep drop because the analysts were saying, why are you guys doing this really expensive fiber to the home thing when you could just reuse the existing copper lines that other companies are? Why are you doing this, right? And so it's never clear that it's going to pay off except in hindsight. And so this is how technology works. Companies take risks, some will fail, some will succeed, and then there'll be some surprises, and then that takes off. So I'm not surprised that this is happening because that's how it's supposed to happen in my mind.
One issue that's captured my attention recently has been data centers, and how much resources they take and where they're located and how beneficial they can be. What's your take on data centers? You obviously were involved in them in some capacity or other. What's your take as they going forward? Do they continue to remain as they are today? You huge resource zappers in communities. Can you put them? Can you scatter them more? Are there more efficient ways to build them or deploy them?
I think that's a great question. I don't know the answer. As you know, Northern Virginia is sort of the epicenter of data centers, right? We've got the highest density of data centers on the planet by far. And we're running into issues about power, right? I think we're getting power from West Virginia at this point. So people have been looking at data center design for a long time now. I don't know that there's been any major breakthrough. Part of the challenge is that having all of that data and processing in close proximity is what makes it so sort of, low latency, high density capability. If you don't have that, if you spread everything out, you do lose something. And so I don't know that there's an alternative. I think the areas that can offer low cost power with space are going to take off more. I don't know that Northern Virginia can, can it keep going at this rate for another 10 years? Maybe. Beyond that, who knows? But I think that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that.
That's very fair. All right, last question.
Sure.
One of your roles as a vice president for public policy was to educate policymakers, be on Capitol Hill or otherwise. How did you find the knowledge base as you approached really complicated technology issues with men and women who have varied backgrounds?
Sure.
And did you walk away worried that there wasn't enough, or that there was that the baseline was enough to make decisions, and then that was part of the role?
So it's interesting with primarily the Hill staff, but also members themselves. It's on one hand it's too much education, and on the other hand it's not enough. And what I mean by that is that you've got so many people, so many groups trying to educate them with all of their own agendas, right? So it's not really education in the sense of here's how this works. It's here's why you should vote for me for whatever my favorite thing is, and they're inundated with that. What I tried to do, and I used to have this series of tech talks where staffers could come, and it took us several years to kind of get the trust. I would try to cover the very basics of how the internet works, everything from undersea cables, sort of the physics, the physical side of the internet, then working up to satellites, working up to the internet protocol layer, how DNS works. Just sort of here's how it works without a particular agenda from, say, Verizon when I was working for them, or any particular spin. When we did that, and once people started trusting it, we got a really good turnout. So there's a lot of interest in learning these things, but the problem is they're inundated with all these sort of issue-specific angles that make it hard. And to be fair, right? I mean, these are staffers who right now might be talking about the internet, cybersecurity, and then in the next hour they have a meeting talking about milk subsidies. So there is a lot of information that's being thrown at them. But in my mind, the internet is going to be affecting everything. Internet and telecom is affecting everything, and so they do need to understand it. And I wish there was a more neutral way for them to learn all this stuff without worrying about, well, okay, so Mike is now going to be putting his angle to this, so I need to filter that out and just understand the basics. So I would say absolutely. I think we need to figure out a way to educate our representatives and their staff in a way that makes sense for them. Because a lot of this issue, cybersecurity, AI, you hear the buzzwords. A lot of the lobbyists will use talking points. But the moment you start digging below that, there really isn't much understanding. And when it comes to technology, that's the most dangerous thing. It's better if you know nothing about something than if you just know the talking points, in many cases.
Interesting. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I can't thank you enough for a very interesting conversation.
Sure.
Much appreciated.
Thanks, Mike. This was great.